It's funny how silence can be mistaken for weakness. They thought they had me figured out, that my quietness was a sign of defeat. But what they didn't realize was that every word I didn't say was building something far stronger than anger, something unshakable. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but not always your story. My family wasn't special, just ordinary people trying to get by. We lived in a modest house with peeling paint on the front porch and an old oak tree in the yard whose branches reached toward the sky like arms stretching after a long sleep. I spent most of my childhood under that tree, reading books or watching the world go by from its shade. It was peaceful there, away from the noise inside our home. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, her hands calloused from years of hard labor. She never complained, though. She simply did what needed to be done. My father, well, he left when I was young, leaving behind only a few faded photos and a lifetime of questions. He became another ghost in the background of our lives, someone we rarely spoke about, but who lingered nonetheless. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. It started so subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the faintest crack in glass before it shatters. It was at work, a new coworker named Lisa joining our team. She seemed nice enough at first, friendly even, until you realized her friendliness came with sharp edges. A comment here, a dismissive laugh there. "You're so quiet, Sarah," she'd say, as if being quiet were somehow less than human. At first, I brushed it off. People often misinterpreted my reserved nature as aloofness or insecurity, but I knew better. Silence had always been my refuge, a way to observe without judgment. But then it began happening more frequently. In meetings, my ideas would be ignored, only to resurface later as Lisa's contributions. Once, during a brainstorming session, I suggested a strategy for improving client retention. No one acknowledged it until Lisa repeated it verbatim 10 minutes later, earning nods of approval around the table. When I tried to clarify, my voice faltered, drowned out by their enthusiasm for her version of my idea. The look she gave me afterwards said everything. "See? You don't matter." That night, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the blank TV screen. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock above the fireplace. I replayed the day over and over in my mind, searching for what I could have done differently. Should I have spoken louder? Been more assertive? Or maybe this was just how things were supposed to be, me quietly fading into the background while others took center stage. As the weeks turned into months, the pattern continued. Conversations at work felt like walking through a minefield, each step carrying the risk of another subtle jab or condescending remark. And it wasn't just Lisa anymore. Other coworkers picked up on her cues, treating me with a mix of indifference and disdain. Invitations to lunch stopped coming. My emails went unanswered unless absolutely necessary. Even simple pleasantries, "Good morning" or "How are you?" felt forced, as if they were checking off some social obligation rather than genuinely caring. At first, I told myself it didn't bother me. After all, I had always preferred solitude to crowded rooms. But deep down, it stung. Each dismissal chipped away at something fragile within me, leaving behind a hollow ache that no amount of rationalization could fill. Still, I stayed silent. What else could I do? Arguing felt futile, like shouting into a void that would only echo back louder criticisms. So instead, I retreated further into myself, letting the walls around me grow thicker with each passing day. Then came the moment, the small, almost imperceptible shift that changed everything. It happened during a particularly grueling week when deadlines loomed and tempers flared. Lisa cornered me in the break room, her tone dripping with false concern. "Sarah, you really need to speak up more," she said, leaning against the counter as if she owned the space. "People won't take you seriously if you keep hiding in the shadows." For a split second, I considered defending myself, explaining that I wasn't hiding, I was observing, that my silence wasn't weakness but strength. But as I opened my mouth to respond, something shifted inside me. Instead of speaking, I simply smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips, and walked away. It wasn't defiance, exactly, but it wasn't submission either. For the first time, I stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. That decision marked the beginning of a transformation, though I didn't fully understand it at the time. Without the constant pressure to justify myself, I found clarity creeping into places once clouded by doubt. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the subtle power dynamics at play, the way certain people thrived on chaos while others crumbled beneath it. Most importantly, I began to see myself differently. I wasn't weak because I stayed quiet. If anything, my silence made me stronger, giving me the space to think, to plan, to grow. And yet, despite these realizations, the injustices didn't stop. In fact, they escalated. Emboldened by my lack of resistance, Lisa and others grew bolder in their disregard for me. Projects I had poured hours into were credited to others. Mistakes I hadn't made were blamed on me. There were whispers in hallways, snickers behind closed doors. Each incident felt like another brick added to the walls separating me from them, but now, strangely, I welcomed it. Distance gave me perspective, and perspective gave me power. One afternoon, as I sorted through paperwork in my cubicle, I overheard a conversation between Lisa and one of the managers. They were discussing upcoming promotions, and Lisa casually mentioned that she doubted I'd ever be considered for advancement. "She's just too passive," she said, her voice oozing confidence. "No one respects her." Something flickered inside me then. Not anger, but resolve. I realized they weren't just underestimating me. They were betting on my silence. And that's when the first threads of karma began to weave themselves together, subtle but undeniable. Over the next few days, I noticed cracks forming in Lisa's polished facade. Her projects started falling behind schedule. Her relationships with clients grew strained. Even her usual charm seemed to falter, replaced by a brittle edge that betrayed her growing unease. Meanwhile, I focused on laying groundwork no one else could see. Late nights spent refining processes, early mornings dedicated to learning new skills. I built alliances quietly, offering help without asking for anything in return. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Colleagues who had once dismissed me now sought my input. Clients who had forgotten my name began requesting me specifically. And through it all, I remained calm, letting the momentum build naturally. Time passed, and the impact of my choices compounded. Lisa's mistakes piled up, her confidence waning with each misstep. Rumors circulated about her competence, her reliability. Yet I never gloated, never pointed fingers. Karma, I knew, didn't need my help. It simply required patience. And then came the final straw, though its full weight wouldn't land for some time. During a major presentation, Lisa stumbled over her words, her usually smooth delivery crumbling under the weight of her own anxiety. As she fumbled for answers, I stepped in, not to save her, but to demonstrate my own capabilities. The room fell silent as I spoke, my voice steady and assured. By the end, even Lisa couldn't hide her surprise. But this isn't the end of the story.
Not yet.
The wheels of karma are still turning, their motion slow and deliberate. Lisa's fall from grace has only just begun, and I'm content to watch from the sidelines, letting events unfold as they will. There's a satisfaction in knowing that justice doesn't require haste. It simply requires faith. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, I feel a strange sense of peace. The road ahead is uncertain, but I know one thing for sure. Those who underestimated me will soon learn the cost of their assumptions. And when that day comes, it won't be my words that haunt them. It'll be the quiet certainty of my presence, unwavering and unyielding. But for now, I wait. The waiting was the hardest part, not because I doubted myself, but because patience demands a kind of strength that isn't always easy to summon. Each day felt like standing on the edge of a quiet storm, watching as the winds gathered force in the distance. Lisa's unraveling continued in small, almost imperceptible ways: missed deadlines, strained interactions with clients, and an increasing reliance on others to cover her missteps. Yet, she still clung to the illusion of control, her polished exterior masking the cracks beneath. I couldn't help but notice how her demeanor had shifted. The once confident woman who breezed through meetings with effortless charm now hesitated before speaking, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for reassurance. It was fascinating, really, to witness the slow erosion of someone who had built their identity on dominance and superiority. But what struck me most was the way people began to treat her differently. The same colleagues who had once fawned over her were now exchanging knowing glances or rolling their eyes when she wasn't looking. Respect, I realized, is fragile. It can be earned slowly, but it can also be lost in an instant. Meanwhile, I continued to focus on my own growth. Every task I completed, every relationship I nurtured, felt like another brick laid in the foundation of something enduring. I didn't seek validation from others anymore. Instead, I found satisfaction in the quiet assurance of knowing I was doing my best work. There was a certain freedom in letting go of the need to prove myself. It allowed me to move forward without the weight of expectation dragging me down. One afternoon, I received an email from upper management requesting a meeting. At first, I assumed it was routine, perhaps a check-in about one of the projects I'd been leading. But when I walked into the conference room, I was surprised to see not only my direct supervisor, but also two executives I rarely interacted with. They greeted me warmly, their expressions unreadable but not unkind. As I took my seat, I felt a flicker of curiosity, not fear, just a quiet awareness that this conversation might carry significance. "We wanted to discuss your recent contributions," one of the executives began, his tone measured and professional. He went on to highlight specific examples of my work, praising both the quality and the impact it had made on the company. I listened intently, nodding occasionally, but keeping my reactions subdued. This wasn't the time for celebration. It was the time for listening. Then came the question I hadn't anticipated. "Have you ever considered stepping into a leadership role?" For a moment, I was silent. Not out of hesitation, but because the idea struck me as both unexpected and inevitable. Leadership had never been something I actively pursued, yet here it was, presented to me as a natural next step. I thought about all the hours I'd spent honing my skills, building connections, and proving my worth, not for them, but for myself. And now, it seemed, those efforts were being recognized in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. "I'd be open to discussing it further," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "But I'd want to ensure I'm prepared to take on that level of responsibility." They nodded approvingly, clearly pleased with my response. We spent the rest of the meeting outlining potential opportunities and timelines, and by the time I left the room, I could feel a subtle shift in the air. Something had changed, not just for me, but within the dynamics of the entire team. Word spread quickly, as it always does in environments like ours. By the end of the day, whispers filled the hallways, though no one approached me directly. Lisa, however, did not whisper. She confronted me head-on during a break later that afternoon, her usual composure slipping just enough to reveal the insecurity underneath. "So, I heard you're being groomed for management," she said, her tone laced with thinly veiled contempt. Guess they're desperate if they're turning to you. Her words should have stung, but they didn't. Instead, they felt hollow, like a last-ditch attempt to regain some semblance of power. I met her gaze evenly, letting the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable, for her, not for me. Finally, I spoke, my voice soft but firm. Desperation doesn't build trust, Lisa. Consistency does. She blinked, caught off guard by my response. For a brief moment, I saw something flash across her face. Regret? Fear? Maybe even a flicker of respect. Whatever it was, it vanished quickly, replaced by the same brittle smile she'd worn earlier. We'll see how long that lasts, she muttered before walking away. And so, the tension simmered. Lisa's position grew increasingly precarious, her attempts to reclaim authority undermined by her own mistakes. Meanwhile, I focused on preparing for the responsibilities ahead, knowing full well that leadership would bring its own challenges. But I welcomed them, not out of ambition, but out of a desire to create something meaningful, something lasting. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of my actions became impossible to ignore. Projects I had championed succeeded beyond expectations, earning recognition not just within our department, but across the company. Clients praised my approach, citing the clarity and care I brought to every interaction. Even those who had once dismissed me now sought my advice, their attitudes shifting in subtle yet undeniable ways. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the growing distance between Lisa and the rest of the team. Her isolation wasn't overt. There were no dramatic confrontations or public humiliations, but it was palpable nonetheless. People stopped inviting her to key discussions. Her opinions carried less weight. And while I never gloated or intervened directly, I couldn't deny the quiet thrill of seeing justice unfold naturally, without any grand gestures or forced resolutions. Still, the story isn't finished. Karma, after all, moves at its own pace, and there are threads yet to be tied. Lisa remains in her role, though her grip on it weakens with each passing day. Upper management has begun discussing restructuring plans, and rumors suggest changes are imminent. Whether she'll survive the coming shifts, or whether she'll finally face the consequences of her actions, remains to be seen. For now, I continue to wait, observing the unfolding events with a sense of calm detachment. The journey has taught me more than I ever expected, not just about others, but about myself. Silence, I've learned, isn't weakness. It's a form of strength, a way of holding space for truth to reveal itself. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't loud or explosive. It's quiet, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. But the final chapter hasn't been written yet. The wheels of karma are still turning, and I know better than to rush them. After all, the best stories are the ones that linger, leaving room for reflection and anticipation. The days that followed felt like standing on the precipice of something vast and inevitable. The air in the office was thick with unspoken tension, a quiet undercurrent that hummed beneath every interaction. Lisa's presence had become a shadow of its former self, her confidence eroded, her influence diminished. She still tried to assert herself, of course, but her efforts were met with polite indifference or outright dismissal. It was as if she were fading before our eyes, not dramatically but gradually, like sunlight retreating behind gathering clouds. I noticed the change most acutely during team meetings. Once, Lisa had dominated these gatherings, steering conversations with an authoritative ease that left little room for dissent. Now, however, her contributions felt forced, her voice hesitant where it used to command attention. When she spoke, people exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others smug, but rarely did they engage directly. Instead, the focus shifted increasingly toward me. My ideas were solicited, my opinions valued. Even those who had once dismissed me now leaned forward when I shared my thoughts, their body language betraying a newfound respect. It wasn't just within our department either. Word of my work had begun to spread throughout the company, reaching ears I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, as I walked through the main lobby, I overheard two executives discussing an upcoming initiative I'd spearheaded. Their tone was approving, almost admiring, and though they didn't see me passing by, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Pride, not arrogance, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my efforts were being recognized without me having to demand it. Lisa noticed too. Her frustration simmered just below the surface, manifesting in small, sharp remarks aimed at anyone who dared to praise me in her presence. "Oh, Sarah's always been good at making herself look indispensable," she said one day, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Too bad indispensability doesn't pay the bills." Her words might have stung once, but now they barely registered. I understood what she was doing, trying to undermine me, to cast doubt where none existed. But her attempts only highlighted her own insecurity, her inability to adapt to a world that no longer revolved around her. So I let her comment slide, responding with nothing more than a faint smile and a polite nod. There was no need to argue. The truth spoke for itself. And yet, despite her growing irrelevance, Lisa refused to go quietly. She doubled down on her efforts, pouring energy into projects that seemed doomed from the start. One such project involved a high-profile client whose account had been languishing for months. Desperate to prove herself, Lisa took charge, promising results that even the most optimistic among us doubted she could deliver. For weeks, she worked tirelessly, burning the midnight oil and sending out frantic emails in the early hours of the morning. But her desperation only made things worse. Deadlines were missed, expectations unmet, and the client grew increasingly impatient. By the time the quarterly review rolled around, the situation had reached a breaking point. Upper management convened a meeting to address the issue, and Lisa, ever eager to salvage her reputation, volunteered to present her findings. As she stood at the front of the conference room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the projector, I couldn't help but feel a pang of something. Not pity, exactly, but perhaps a fleeting acknowledgement of how far she had fallen. Her presentation was disjointed, riddled with half-formed explanations and defensive justifications. The executives listened impassively, their expressions unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence, a heavy, charged pause that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then one of them leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Lisa. We'll take this under advisement." That was all he said. No praise, no critique, just a neutral acknowledgement that signaled nothing and everything at once. Lisa returned to her seat, her face pale but composed. She knew, as we all did, that this was the beginning of the end. After the meeting, rumors swirled like wildfire. Some speculated that Lisa would be reassigned to a less critical role. Others whispered about potential layoffs. Whatever the outcome, it was clear that her position was no longer secure. Meanwhile, I found myself fielded with requests to step in and stabilize the accounts she had mishandled. At first, I hesitated, not out of reluctance, but because I wanted to ensure I was ready for the responsibility. But as the opportunities mounted, I realized this was more than just a chance to prove myself. It was an opportunity to reshape the narrative, to demonstrate what true leadership looked like. So I accepted, approaching each task with the same quiet determination that had carried me this far. I immersed myself in the details, listening intently to clients' concerns and crafting solutions tailored to their needs. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. Clients who had once expressed frustration now praised the turnaround, citing my professionalism and dedication. And while I never sought recognition for my efforts, it came nonetheless, in the form of glowing feedback, unexpected bonuses, and invitations to high-level strategy sessions. Through it all, I remained acutely aware of Lisa's presence, or rather, her absence. She still showed up to work each day, still attended meetings and submitted reports, but her role had become largely ceremonial. People stopped seeking her input, stopped including her in important discussions. She drifted through the office like a ghost, her once commanding aura reduced to a faint echo. But karma is a patient force, and I knew better than to assume her story was finished. There were still threads left untied, consequences yet to unfold. One evening, as I packed up my things to leave the office, I overheard fragments of a conversation between two colleagues lingering near the water cooler. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "Did you hear? Corporate sending someone to evaluate the team next week," one of them said. "Apparently, they're looking for areas to streamline." Streamline. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Layoffs weren't uncommon in our industry, especially during periods of restructuring, but this felt different. This felt targeted. I glanced toward Lisa's desk, where she sat scrolling through her computer screen, seemingly oblivious to the murmurs around her. Or perhaps she wasn't oblivious at all. Perhaps she simply chose not to acknowledge them, clinging to the hope that somehow she could weather the storm. As I drove home that night, the city lights reflecting off my windshield, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The journey had been longer and more complex than I'd ever imagined, filled with moments of doubt and triumph alike. But through it all, I had stayed true to myself, to my values, my principles, my quiet strength. And while I couldn't predict exactly how things would unfold, I knew one thing for certain. Justice, when it arrives, is often quieter than we expect, but no less powerful for it. The evaluation team arrived the following Monday, their presence casting a shadow over the office. Meetings were scheduled, assessments conducted, and feedback collected. Lisa, unsurprisingly, struggled to keep up. Her presentations lacked cohesion, her answers to pointed questions evasive at best. I watched from the sidelines, saying little, but observing everything. By the end of the week, the verdict was clear, at least to those paying attention. Changes were coming, and Lisa's name was at the top of the list. Still, the final act has yet to play out. The evaluation team's recommendations are due next Friday, and until then, uncertainty lingers in the air like static electricity. Will Lisa fight back, or will she accept her fate with whatever dignity she is left? And what will happen to the rest of us, those who have borne witness to her rise and fall, those who have played our parts in this unfolding drama? For now, I wait, content in the knowledge that the story is nearing its climax. Karma, after all, is a slow-moving river, carving its path with precision and purpose. And though I cannot see the final bend, I trust that it will lead somewhere meaningful, somewhere satisfying. But the tale does not end here. Not yet. The days leading up to the evaluation team's final report felt like holding my breath. Each moment stretched taut with anticipation, yet I refused to let it show. Around me, the office buzzed with nervous energy, a collective undercurrent of anxiety that seemed to ripple through every conversation and interaction. People spoke in hushed tones, speculating about who might be affected by the impending changes. Some whispered names. Others exchanged furtive glances. But no one dared say anything outright. Not while the evaluators were still present, their sharp eyes and meticulous questions probing deeper than anyone had anticipated. Lisa, for her part, seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing day. Her usual bravado had all but disappeared, replaced by a brittle fragility that made her seem almost unrecognizable. She attended meetings mechanically, offering contributions that were either ignored or met with polite skepticism. When asked directly for input, she stumbled over her words, her explanations disjointed and defensive. It was as if she were trying to hold on to something, a shred of relevance, perhaps, but the harder she grasped, the more it slipped through her fingers. I watched her unravel from a distance, not with malice, but with a detached curiosity. There's a strange kind of poetry in witnessing someone so consumed by their own need for control lose it entirely. Lisa had spent years building a persona based on dominance and superiority, only to find that the foundation beneath her was far weaker than she'd ever imagined. And now, as the walls closed in around her, she was left scrambling to salvage what little remained. But it wasn't just Lisa who was being scrutinized. The entire team was under the microscope. The evaluators conducted individual interviews, asking pointed questions about workflow, leadership dynamics, and areas for improvement. During my session, I answered honestly, focusing on solutions rather than blame. When they asked about challenges within the team, I acknowledged them without naming names, framing them instead as opportunities for growth. Every group has its struggles, I said, my voice calm and measured. What matters is how we address them. They nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes before moving on to the next question. By the time the interview ended, I felt a sense of quiet confidence, not because I believed I had impressed them, but because I knew I had been authentic. Authenticity, I'd learned, carried its own weight, especially in moments like these. As the week drew to a close, the tension in the office reached a fever pitch. Conversations became shorter, more guarded. Even casual pleasantries felt forced, as though everyone was bracing themselves for impact. On Friday afternoon, the evaluators called a meeting to announce their preliminary findings. The room fell silent as they entered, their expressions unreadable behind masks of professionalism. One of them, a tall man with graying temples and an air of authority, stepped forward to address us. His voice was steady, his tone neutral. After careful consideration, we've identified several areas where improvements can be made, he began, pausing briefly to scan the room. While there are many strengths within this department, there are also inefficiencies that need to be addressed. To ensure long-term success, restructuring will be necessary. A murmur rippled through the audience, low and uneasy. Restructuring. The word hung heavy in the air, loaded with implications. He continued, outlining specific recommendations, streamlining processes, redistributing responsibilities, and, in a move that came as no surprise to anyone, reassigning certain roles. Names weren't mentioned explicitly, but the subtext was clear. Lisa's position was untenable. When the announcement concluded, the room remained eerily quiet. No one moved, no one spoke. We simply sat there, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. Finally, the evaluators dismissed us, leaving us to process the news in our own way. As people filed out of the conference room, some looked relieved, others anxious. A few shot furtive glances at Lisa, who sat frozen in her chair, staring straight ahead as though willing herself to disappear. For the rest of the day, she avoided eye contact, retreating to her desk and burying herself in paperwork. Whether she was genuinely focused on her tasks or simply trying to avoid confrontation, I couldn't tell. But I did notice something interesting. Despite her obvious distress, she didn't lash out. For once, she kept her emotions in check, choosing silence over retaliation. Perhaps, I thought, she understood on some level that fighting back would only hasten her downfall. That evening, as I packed up my things to leave, I found myself lingering near her desk. She glanced up briefly, her expression guarded but resigned. "You must be thrilled," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you've been waiting for this, haven't you?" Her words caught me off guard, not because they were accusatory, but because they carried a hint of vulnerability. For the first time, I saw past the polished facade, past the arrogance and condescension, to the person underneath. She wasn't invincible. She was human, flawed and fragile like the rest of us. And in that moment, I felt compassion. "I didn't wait for anything," I replied softly. "I just did my job. What happens next isn't about me. It's about choices. Yours included." She stared at me for a long moment, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she returned her attention to her computer screen. I turned and walked away, leaving her to her thoughts. Over the weekend, the office was eerily quiet, save for the hum of cleaning crews and the occasional security guard making rounds. I spent my time reflecting on everything that had transpired, the subtle shifts in power, the quiet victories, the lessons learned along the way. Karma, I realized, wasn't just about punishment or retribution. It was about balance, about actions finding their natural consequences. And while Lisa's fate was sealed, it wasn't mine to celebrate. Justice had played its hand, and now it was time to move forward. Monday morning brought clarity. Official emails arrived shortly after we clocked in, detailing the restructuring plan and its immediate effects. As expected, Lisa's role was dissolved, her responsibilities redistributed among other team members, including me. There was no dramatic scene, no tearful goodbye. She simply gathered her belongings, signed the necessary paperwork, and left without a word. By the time lunch rolled around, her desk was empty, her nameplate gone. In the days that followed, life in the office resumed its usual rhythm, though with noticeable differences. Projects moved forward more smoothly, communication improved, and morale slowly began to rebound. My new responsibilities challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I welcomed them, knowing they represented an opportunity to grow and lead by example. Colleagues who had once doubted me now sought my guidance, their trust earned not through grand gestures, but through consistent effort and integrity. Yet even as I embraced this new chapter, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite finished. Lisa's departure marked the end of one phase, but karma's wheel rarely stops turning. Somewhere out there, beyond the confines of our office, her journey continued, and with it, the potential for further transformation. Would she learn from her mistakes? Would she rebuild, reinvent herself, or succumb to bitterness? Only time would tell. For now, though, I focused on the present, the work in front of me, the relationships I cherished, the quiet strength I carried within. Revenge, I had discovered, wasn't about destruction. It was about evolution, about becoming someone who could navigate adversity with grace and resilience. And as I sat at my desk, sunlight streaming through the window and warming my hands, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. Karma, after all, doesn't rush. It lingers, patient and deliberate, until the timing is just right. And when it finally arrives, it leaves behind not chaos, but clarity. But the echoes of this story still linger, unresolved threads waiting to be woven into something greater. Because true justice isn't always immediate, it's enduring. And sometimes, the most profound resolutions come not with fanfare, but with the simple realization that peace is its own reward. The weeks following Lisa's departure felt like the calm after a storm, a fragile, tenuous peace that seemed to hover just above the surface of our daily routines. The office settled into its new rhythm, and though there were still challenges, they felt manageable, almost predictable. My role expanded further, not just in responsibilities but in influence. People looked to me for direction, trusting my judgment in ways I hadn't anticipated when this journey began. It was humbling, gratifying even, but beneath it all, I couldn't shake the sense that something was still unresolved. Lisa hadn't vanished entirely from our collective consciousness. Rumors trickled back occasionally, through mutual acquaintances or overheard conversations at industry events. She'd landed another position, though details were scarce. Some said she was struggling, others claimed she was thriving. I didn't dwell on it. Her story had diverged from mine, and I had chosen long ago to focus only on what I could control. Still, there was an unspoken understanding between us now, an invisible thread connecting her choices to their consequences, her actions to their echoes. Then came the email. It arrived late one evening, sent from an address I barely recognized. The subject line read simply, "A conversation." At first, I considered ignoring it, dismissing it as spam or some misplaced outreach. But curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked open. "Sarah," it began, her tone formal yet hesitant. "I know we didn't part on the best terms, and I won't pretend otherwise. What happened? Well, let's just say I've had time to reflect. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. Not to rehash old grievances, but to talk about moving forward. No expectations, no obligations. Just closure." My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I reread her words. Closure. The concept felt foreign, almost surreal. For so long, I had carried the weight of everything that had transpired, letting it shape me without ever fully releasing it. And now, here was Lisa, extending what might have been an olive branch, or perhaps a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of dignity. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. Ignoring her wouldn't bring me any closer to resolution. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, neutral ground where neither of us held sway. When I walked in, she was already seated by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She looked different, smaller somehow, more subdued. Gone was the polished confidence that had once defined her, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that made her seem almost human. "Thank you for coming," she said as I approached, her voice softer than I remembered. "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted, sliding into the chair across from her. "But here I am." She nodded, as if expecting my candor. "I imagine you have questions. Or maybe anger. I wouldn't blame you if you did." To my surprise, I didn't feel anger, not anymore. What I felt instead was a deep, quiet exhaustion, as though carrying the weight of those years had finally drained me of anything stronger. "Anger doesn't serve me anymore," I replied evenly. "What I want is understanding. Why reach out now? After everything?" Her gaze dropped to her mug, her fingers tracing its rim absently. "Because I realized something recently, something I should have seen a long time ago. You weren't weak because you stayed silent. You were strong. Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. And maybe I needed to lose everything to see that." Her admission caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it carried a raw honesty I hadn't anticipated. For years, I had envisioned this moment, fantasized about seeing her stripped of her arrogance, forced to confront the truth of who she was. Yet now that it was happening, I found myself grappling with emotions I hadn't prepared for. Empathy, sadness, even a flicker of pity. "I'm not interested in gloating," I said finally, my voice steady despite the turbulence inside me. "What's done is done. But I do wonder, do you regret it? Not just losing your job, but everything else. The way you treated people. The choices you made." She hesitated, her eyes searching mine as if weighing how much truth I could handle. "Yes," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I regret it all. But regret isn't enough, is it? It doesn't fix things. It doesn't undo the damage." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't, but it's a start." We sat there for a while longer, talking about nothing and everything, the weather, old coworkers, the strange unpredictability of life. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apology that magically erased the past. Instead, there was quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that some wounds heal slowly, if at all. By the time we parted ways, I felt lighter, as though shedding a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. In the days that followed, I thought often about our conversation. About Lisa, about karma, about the delicate balance between justice and forgiveness. Her fall from grace hadn't been sudden or explosive. It had been gradual, inevitable, like water wearing away stone. And while I couldn't change what had happened, I could choose how to carry it moving forward. The final chapter of this story doesn't end with triumph or vindication. It ends with clarity, with the quiet realization that revenge, in its purest form, isn't about destruction. It's about transformation, about becoming someone who can rise above bitterness, who can find strength in silence, who can let go when holding on serves no purpose. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has transpired, I feel a profound sense of peace. The road I traveled wasn't easy, but it led me somewhere meaningful, to a version of myself I can be proud of. Karma played its part, yes, but so did patience, resilience, and the unwavering belief that justice, when it arrives, is rarely loud or flashy. Sometimes, it's simply the quiet certainty that you've done your best, and that, in itself, is enough. And so, the tale concludes, not with fireworks, but with the gentle exhale of breath after a long-held tension. The echoes of Lisa's actions will linger, as they always do, but they no longer define me. They are merely part of the tapestry, threads woven into a larger narrative of growth, redemption, and quiet resolve. Sometimes, the most satisfying endings aren't endings at all. They're beginnings, new chapters waiting to unfold, shaped by lessons learned and truths embraced. And as I turn the page, ready to write whatever comes next, I know one thing for certain. This story has already changed me in ways I'll carry forever.